It was Monday, 29th of March, 2009, the day of the hearing of the Declaration of Wizards. Soon after midnight people began gathering outside the European Wizarding Parliament building, its high walls protected by an array of security spells which allowed only employees and ministers to enter. The protesters, if that's what they were, gathered quietly and peacefully. For now, few words were being exchanged between one another. What they wanted to say was painted onto banners, reading justice, protection, equality. Depending on one's point of view, the protesters could be conjurists, or they could be non-wizards. Others gathered with them, and so, by 10 o'clock in the morning large crowds were outside, their presence not going unnoticed by the head of the European Parliament, his blonde hair catching the late spring sunlight. It was a lot of people, thought Draco Malfoy. To ensure justice, protection, and equality, the day would be a long one. 5 hours before, in the early hours of the morning, Harry had apparated to meet Hermione at the Strasbourg apartment and had been taken aback that she was pacing the living room, looking as if she had not been to bed. Insisting on her taking a shower and eating breakfast, he looked down into Parliament Square, and at the dozens of people collecting there, not doing a lot, just milling around, holding banners, talking. Like the rest of the city, its architecture was sleek yet craggy. Bits had been added as the centuries had rolled by and the existing architecture had meshed with the new. It was the very center in which he and Hermione would be attending today, not sleek and new but wooden and cramped, wherein Clovis, king of the Franks, had consented to a wizard-witten building be constructed, at the very center of what was to become the Holy Roman Empire. Whereas in Britain it had happened a 2 centuries later, under Alfred, King Clovis I had recognized the significance of hedge wizardry, paganism as the Christians had termed it, and allowed it a formal meeting place. It was the oldest of its kind, and its significance had not gone unnoticed to Harry. He and Hermione had apparated into the antechamber, which ran the whole perimeter outside the inside written chamber, Hermione walking, and then sitting ever so often to read through her pre-prepared notes. An hour later and Harry was joined by Callias Lupin, not many days out of St. Mungo's, still drawn and haggard after his ordeal. But his mind was keen and bright. He went through Harry's points one by one, explaining that he would have to give justification to each once the proponent case had been heard, and wanted to be sure all was watertight. "I am under no illusion that they have already decided on the outcome," said Callias, scanning the faces of the wizards, in their royal blue robes, "and I cannot see much coming of this, barring a few amendments to domestic law, and non-wizard domestic law." And yet, thought Harry, what with the forthcoming Parliament elections and some potential poor decisions from Draco Malfoy on the non-wizard-born wizards and witches stopped from being candidates, this was significant. It was certainly significant to the what looked now like hundreds of wizards and witches, on a windy, changeable Monday morning who were outside the building. It was not long until 9 o'clock. In the limestone-walled Grand Chamber, 30 representatives of the European Parliament, one for each member state in Wizarding Europe. Spells had been cast to ensure security. They know they are there for as long as they are needed, so let's hope they've all been to the toilet. In the center, at a chair near the front, Draco Malfoy now sat, catching the eye of the Minister for Magic of France as he shuffled the papers in front of him. Hermione cleared her throat uncertainly as he caught her eye. Harry nudged her and she laughed lightly. "Sorry, just nervous," she replied, from her seat on the left-hand side of the chamber. Harry, who should have been in the right bank of seating, was sitting next to her. This part of the European Wizarding Council was still virtually empty. He looked at her face, pale, lined, weariness there, illustrating the strain she had been under, for he was sure they had not been on her forehead last year. He reached out for her hand. "All this work I've done, all you've done ... We have spent so long on this, and now ... today." Her voice lapsed to silence as she looked down again. "We were there, at the Witten, when Sam was called, in November. But this ... this feels..." Harry said nothing. He knew what she meant. It felt overwhelming, as if they were on a cliff edge. So many things rode on this hearing. One false move, one slip of the tongue, one accidental withholding of an important fact could color the whole proceeding. They sat there for a little longer as the seats filled behind them. Hermione pointed out Mrs. Firmlin, a colleague, with whom she had been working to present Europe's position, with whom she had spent time as she established herself as aide to the minister. Behind them, other colleagues, raising a hand in her direction and nodding. Harry took to his side as the British ministry began to arrive, and he was surprised to see Bertie Wurgs come to sit next to him. Oval Office representative and others, he told Harry, carefully. It wasn't long until the chamber was full to capacity, even overfull. Harry looked at the court before him. Wizards from all of the sovereign countries were the most looking over pre-hearing briefing notes. Hermione was not required to say anything, which Harry knew had been a relief to her. The wizards of the hearing had been in session since 7 that morning scrutinizing it, one or two of the members of the European Wizarding Parliament nudging one another and pointing out things to one another. Then, Harry recognized a face, one which he had seen before at Strasbourg. Anders Hennig, Minister for Magic of Germany, his bearded face twitching as he looked at his notice. Hennig, thought Harry. He had come across that name before in his mother's work. Although the name hadn't been Anders, the Hennig he had come across had been guilty of 10 murders of non-wizards during the time of Dumbledore's army, educated at Durmstrang, a hardliner in his feelings about people lacking magical ability. As Macmullen put it, he had strong feelings about people lacking magical ability continuing to live and breathe. But, again, there was not enough evidence to put this Hennig behind the collapse of a wall in Frankfurt killing over 100 people, some prominent German wizards included, and the sudden absence of oxygen in a nightclub in Augsburg. To call him a conjurist would put it mildly, to call him a murderer would be closer to the mark. But, there was no evidence, and any evidence there might have been would have been carefully dismantled and hidden. And, just to the right of Hermione, with other wizards, ones having presumably called the hearing were taking their seats, shaking hands with someone else he knew. Wolfgang Brueck, headmaster of the Durmstrang Institute. The puppet head. For the headmaster, Affectly, of that northern school was Gellert Grindelwald. He and Ron had had a bet as to whether that wizard would arrive. But then, he was accused of so many crimes that, if he had come already it is likely that he had been arrested. Or, an arrest would have been attempted. Harry looked at the ministers representing the different countries again, many of them exchanging wordless greetings with Brueck. Or perhaps not, perhaps there were crimes too great, and too numerous to be investigated without opening a Ravenclaw's box of diadems. Next to him, Curious Lupin edged past, his limbs creaking into a seated position, and Harry, a squeeze of his fiancée's hand, took his seat with him. Draco Malfoy instructed the ushers of the court to close the doors, which creaked heavily and banged closed. 88,888,888. We are gathered to hear the petition raised by a group of wizards calling themselves the Wizards of Old Magic. Draco Malfoy, their former school friend and now president of the European Wizarding Council, pointed his wand to his throat in order to spell amplify his voice. Having heard the position from the European Council, he nodded at Hermione, whose testament with respect to the declaration of wizards within wizarding law had been ought to read from the parchment. Their legal representative will begin by outlining the points of the declaration which is to be heard and judgment. Wolfgang Brueck. He looked at the Durmstrang headmaster and nodded slightly, the candlelight catching his hair again. Harry forced himself to not look at Hermione. Wolfgang Brueck, you have presented the key points of the declaration which you wish to be passed into law. As was the protocol, the proponent, or defender of the hearing stood next, acknowledged the president and presented his case. The court came to a silence as all watched the headmaster get to his feet, which he did rather slowly. All eyes, hostile, ally, were on him. Pertinent in the current climate of attacks, my friends, the Wizards of Old Magic, thereto undersigned. Brueck held up the original declaration for the court to see, allowing the parchment's lengthy diatribe against non-wizards to fall away. Believe that the fundamental rights of magical humans are now being seriously undermined by the legislation brought to bear in each of the European Parliament countries. Non-wizards are deliberately and actively seeking to discriminate against wizards, to the point of gelding us of our magic. A flick of the wrist and Bruick's declaration folded itself up again. Next to him, Callias snorted cynically. One or two of the mupes looked at him in surprise. Harry leaned across to look at Hermione. She was staring straight ahead, at Draco Malfoy, who was eyeing Bruick with interest. As such, we bring the declaration, to be enshrined in European law, Bruick continued, addressing both the mupes and the rest of the people gathered there, clearly accustomed to speaking to large audiences and using it to his full advantage, recognizing formally the existence, continued survival, way of living and right to exist practice magic. We recognize that the right to exist, survive and practice are subject to the rights of non-wizards to exist and survive. Since the dawn of history, wizards have been repressed by non-wizards. Failing to integrate us, failing to assimilate their communities. They claim. They claim. He bellowed, mockingly, recompense for years wizards' repression on their lives. Year. Year. A low grumble sounded. Opposing them, a number of voices around released noises which sounded like, "Pa." Draco, after a tiny pause, raised himself slowly to his feet. I must ask the representatives and their respective retinues to remain silent. We can hardly hear the Honorable Headmaster of Durmstrang. Should there be more disturbances, the offenders will be removed. Honorable. Callias clicked his tongue. Harry looked at his face. Paler, far paler than usual, the minister had been through for Remus. And his mother, he knew. Then tried to clear their faces from his mind. He looked around, trying to get his mind on the task, his task, which he had to do clearly and carefully. He rubbed his palms together, which had grown moist. Our way of life is increasingly coming under threat, Bruick continued, his moustache twitching as he talked like an injured caterpillar. Daily there is restrictions on practice, and this impinges on how wizards go about their daily life. More years, but stilted this time. We come to the statements prepared for the Ministry of Magic of the United Kingdom and the European Government. Thank you, Herr Bruick. Draco nodded in acknowledgement, then sought out Harry, then nodded when he'd caught his eye as the hearing ministers noted down furiously information onto sheets of paper and parchments. I invite Harry Potter to give the statement prepared on behalf of the Ministry for Magic of the United Kingdom. Mechanically, heads turned in his direction. Harry could feel a flush of color to his cheek. He then noticed Hermione, who, though still obviously nervous, was smiling in what she obviously thought was an encouraging way. He flexed his feet as he stood up, to give himself a little more confidence, which was shaken again when Callias growled, "Get on up there, Harry Potter." Stumbling a little, as he missed a low step from the seating to the lectern to the right of Draco, at which Bruick had been just moments ago, he swallowed. Get this right, he told himself as he noticed that the Durmstrang headmaster was fixing him with a beady stare, and he looked down sharply at his prepared notes. The audience was again silent. No one wanted to miss a word. The history of all magic, Harry began, looking around the room. So many faces. So much expectation on him. He looked down to Callias, who had his eyes focused totally on Harry, and then to Hermione, who was looking around the room. He saw Bertie Wurgs, quill poised. Harry swallowed again. "Get in with it, man!" shouted one wizard from near the front. Harry stopped, looked down to where he last remembered he had been in his notes, and, like a light switching on in his mind, as his consciousness connected his speech with the significance of his surroundings, he did so. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harry began again. "The history of all magic is one which has come to the forefront in recent years. It is a representation of the past, of wizardry, of ancestry, to the beginning of written records in Britain, and indeed, Europe." He looked at Callias, who was still fixing his eyes on him. "It has a strong history, which puts wizards at the forefront, and always has done. It is pertinent to note that we are indeed in such an historic building to listen to wizards' requests to enshrine ourselves in law, this building in which the original old magic was practiced, legally, and freely. King Clovis himself, instead of killing the pagan, began this parliament." Harry swung his arm out in a quarter circle to draw attention to the 1400-year-old inner chamber in which the declaration was being heard, this room in which wizards were free to be wizards, and practice wizardry. Harry looked down at his notes, and heard in the audience vague talking. Some of it sounded like assent. Good. A lot were listening. Harry smiled. I believe even the first king of France would be proud to know that his gift to the Grand Witan, its building and its conventions, are still being used today. He nodded at Callias, then smiled again. I represent the position of the British Ministry for Magic, our country having a similar paradigm shift in the form of Alfred the Great's Grand Witan. As such, I draw your attention to the universal link. Such a connection, made within the last 20 years by Severus Snape, former head teacher of Hedgewood School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Who is currently missing? Shouted someone, whose sentiments were backed up with several indistinct yeses. Harry ignored them, who was awarded a Merlin Prize for physical defense 2 years running. This link, as we very much are aware, illustrates the interconnectedness of all humans, whether magical or not. We do not reject the science-based link, interrupted Bruick, smiling widely. Harry noticed, from the wizards behind Draco, Minister Hennig's smile was a snap. It has been proven time and again. Then you will agree, Herr Bruick, that the work begun by Alfred the Great's Grand Witan, that there was a great deal of evidence of cooperation between wizards and non-wizards, of spell standardization and teaching formalities, where scientific discoveries went hand in hand. Believe me, there is almost inexhaustible evidence. Harry smiled again, and there were a few laughs, which broke the tension. Herr Bruick was glaring at Harry now, his eyes narrowing. And then, he got to his feet. If I may, President Malfoy, he began, silkily, and then continued, as Draco nodded his assent, Britain has long been held as a land with no magic. Students simply do not care about the love of learning wizardry for its own sake. They are arrogant, with no pride in their heritage. Point made. With a lot more agreement now with the audience nodding and mumbling, Bruick sat down with a self-satisfied smile lazily crawling around his lips. Harry saw Hermione jerk her head towards Callias. But the Minister of Magic was not looking at her. He was looking at Harry. Thank you, Herr Bruick, Harry continued, looking at his notes again to find his place, then looked around to the audience who, all at once, seemed the most important people to convince. The mutes were sitting still, silent, watching the wizards before them and their reaction. The universal link and is the key to this hearing, the British Ministry for Magic proposes. As such, the reciprocators operating in Britain since Joseph Black have formed long and intricate links in mutual cooperation between us. As soon as engineering was available, broom technology was used by the founder of the reciprocators for flight. The range of medicines and potions available has been widened and made safer, jobs and careers have prospered. To this cooperation there have been setbacks along the way. Harry chanced to look at Bruick, and found that he was looking directly at Malfoy, and recent research building on our genetic interconnectedness has resulted in the finding, verified by several independent wizards around the world and doctors with vested interests, that everyone, no matter what they demonstrate, has the potential to have magic. Silence. Or, rather, less than silence. If there had been words accompanying the open mouths of some of the wizards gaping at him, the seeming absence of air particles would not allow their transmission. I was sure that the concept of the reciprocators would merge in the testimony of the British Ministry, announced Draco Malfoy, breaking the thrall, but I did not expect it to be so soon. He turned to Harry, some of his blonde hair falling over his forehead. Please continue, Mr. Potter. Harry looked down at his notes, realizing that he had finished. Panicked slightly, he looked back at Callias, who was staring at him still. Surely he had not finished? There was surely more he had to say? It didn't feel like any longer than 5 minutes. I've finished, said Harry awkwardly. At his words, as he looked to Callias again, dimly aware that there was some clapping going on. He looked round to Hermione and saw that she was on her feet, clapping fervently. Next to her, Ron, who had been in charge of the broadcast back to the British Ministry, who was giving him a thumbs up. No. A voice came from the audience, and with it, a wizard, carefully raising himself up to his feet. Callias Lupin, to an audience of diminishing volume, looked around, his recovery from his self-inflicted testing of Remus's potion still evident around his features. Harry was just in the process of debating with himself whether to stay where he was, or leave the lectern when the British Minister for Magic began to speak from where he stood. Harry planted his feet, listening. "You have more to share with us, Minister?" asked Draco, smiling with his mouth to Callias. "Indeed. My esteemed colleague here, Mr. Harry Potter, has represented the historical basis for integration. It only remains for me to reinforce our point politically. Our ministry stands as a beacon of light to all those who say that non-wizards should not be at the forefront of everything which Herr Broek outlined." Harry noticed that the minister was sweating as he spoke, his skin as translucent as porcelain held to the light. But his clear limited recovery was not stopping him from speaking. "We have brought into our laws measures not to divide our nation, but to unite it." The link, which was verified almost the day it was discovered by scientists representing the European Parliament. He jabbed a finger towards Draco. But Draco Malfoy merely dropped his head, passing a letter across to Pierre Firmelin, who was sitting on his left. The little wizard read the parchment, then got to his feet. "However, the integration is not a safe measure, Callias Lupin," Firmelin replied, pointing to the letter, its edges curling over the edge of the desk. "I have evidence provided here, by a one." He peered carefully at the name. Neville Longbottom, of Hedgewood School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He looked back to Callias, to the effect of environmental dangers to non-wizards. "There have been serious incidents which have made the students gravely ill. This teacher confides to us." "This is quite true," agreed Callias, reluctantly, beads of sweat on his forehead. "And the students have recovered. Their parents have insisted they come back. That shows a good deal of commitment for our vision." "Yet, not half so many as came in September," replied Broek, pushing himself to his feet, and addressing Firmelin and Draco. "Yet again, Callias Lupin has attempted to refute the truth, Minister," he added, as he did in November. Harry, who was still at the stand, opened his mouth, agog. "Does this have any relevance to the declaration?" asked Draco, steadily. Callias was still on his feet, and was glaring at Broek. "I merely point out that any declaration of wizards must acknowledge non-wizards, and since non-wizards are just part of a continuum of ourselves, then it is madness to exclude them." Harry waited for Callias to sit down, but he didn't. Instead, Wolfgang Broek got back up again. "And yet you, Callias Lupin, are a traitor to wizardkind. You tried to suppress a book which my esteemed colleague Professor Felix Son wrote, based on the universal link that you love so well. You are also ruining the futures of all at Hedgewoods with the surface learning that now takes place as your staff accommodate non-wizards. I merely seek wizards' position in law to safeguard us all. Wizards have always lived apart from non-wizards, culturally historially." Broek's eyes moved lazily over to the raised platform, where Harry had been sitting, waiting to be dismissed. He was standing up again. It was convenient, nothing more. European history was written down by Clovis, just as Alfred did. It was recorded that non-wizards did get ill, they did sicken. There was a rumbling of low talking in the room as the audience was talking. Harry noticed Callias glaring at him. "But a lot of non-wizards adapted, despite accelerated timelines." Accelerated timelines. Harry heard echo. Sounds like non-wizards should be taken out of the school immediately. He swallowed. Whatever he said seemed to be making everything worse for the ministry. "Indeed," Broek continued, looking at Harry, his eyes telling him that he had been the greatest advantage Broek could have asked for. "Because of these associations we are now experiencing areas of weaker magic. Spells are simply becoming ineffective in areas of non-magical populations." "Rubbish!" shouted some people from the back. "Nonsense." "I wish it were," said Broek, his head shaking in sadness. "It is an example of an unstable magical field, a key position in history, and node, which is why we, as representatives of interested wizarding institutions," he waved his arm at the other wizards seated with him. "And as Hennig gave a nod, we ask our wit and its council as to whether, on such evidence, non-wizards should be divided from us for their safety. We have never denied our common heritage," he added, nodding towards Draco. Now there was silence. It had been said, and could never be unsaid. The Wizards wanted division of wizards from non-magical people. That was unprecedented. Most of the faces of the audience were now on Draco Malfoy, their eyes searching his face for an answer and, when they didn't get one, looked past him and at the blue plum moops. I will highlight a point from the prepared statement that the Ministry of European Wizarding Parliament heard several hours ago, and I thank Hermione Granger for her statement. Harry's eyes darted over to Hermione, whose cheeks had pinked. Non-wizards are becoming endangered by violent acts by wizards and are, as such, appealing for the help that they need through legislation. There are areas of illness and spell extinction. It is beyond the Ministry's reasonable doubt that this is happening because of integration. And where do we draw the line? Shouted someone from the back. Apes and monkeys? Cats and dogs? Animagi who have got stuck? There was laughter at this which, thought Harry, was better than the shouting at one another that Cleus and Brooke had been doing. No, now, please. Draco held up a hand. He was smiling. Homo sapiens only, I believe Herr Brooke means, and a potential division between magical and non. Safety is, of course, of paramount importance. But, shouted out a voice, and it took a few seconds to realize to Harry that it had been him, your history, at this historic border between the Franks and the Alemanni. The beginning of the history of the Anglo-Saxons. In the days, the years after Clovis, this chamber was used by all people, wizards and non-wizards met here, traded, held council. Are you unaware, in your meticulous research, Herr Brooke, of the first wizard who brought his case before the assembly here? There was an undercurrent of noise. Harry refused to look at Cleus or Hermione in case he faltered. Brooke could not go unchallenged in face of conflicting historical record. Widukind came here, leader of the Saxons. They remained pagan and refused to convert to Christianity. He leaned across towards Draco, and continued, as if having only an intimate conversation with him, did you know that Widukind's name translates to wooden-legged, intelligence and use of nature? He was a hedge wizard, using what we, and Professor Felixson would call old magic. He changed a glance at Brooke, who was looking back at him, impassively, and before Charlemagne opposed him in battle he came here, to the Witton, to speak for the few against the many. Harry turned, as if to address the audience now. But the continuation of the story was told, not by him, but by the German wizarding chancellor, Anders Hennig. Widukind had the choice in coming here, but his way of life was challenged, explained Hennig, his solemn, low voice captivating all present. Widukind was murdered because he was a wizard. His knowledge had been passed down through the ages and his art of the wise. Perhaps he would not have stood in the way of Charles the Great, magicless, as the Strasbourg Witton had made Widukind. Are you suggesting that Widukind, of legend, was stripped of his magic? Draco asked, intrigued. Indeed. He argued on the impinging of Saxon lands by Franks. He threatened Charlemagne. He then offered to fight the Holy Roman Emperor without magic and declared that he would still win. Harry said, recalling the long letters he had read of his mother's, which outlined all of this history. What happened? He lost, and so did the Germanic Saxons. Their sacred tree was cut down by Charlemagne. That tree was the origin of wizards' wands. It represented great power and strength, and non-wizards seeking to subjugate us again to wizard us by making us remove our robes, our wands, banish our brooms. It is a situation which militant conjurists are scared of today, and rightly so. And, in the United Kingdom, conjurists are persecuted. It is this country, the so-called land with no magic, which seeks, through their laws, to destroy Wizardkind. 88,888,888. 10 minutes after Hennig had sat down, and an address was given telling all present what the next steps were, an adjournment for moot discussion was called. Harry, glad to step down from the podium, approached Hermione. You did what you could, said Hermione, taking his hand. What else could you do? Yes, you were representing the British Ministry. But history is history, it happened, or it didn't. Well, I feel like a fool, Harry admitted, walking with her towards the door and out into the cooler corridor which circumferenced the hall. I listened to Dad, I tried not to get involved. But, Callias, you saw his face, didn't you? He doesn't look well, Hermione agreed, casting a glance at Callias, pacing near a fireplace ahead in the circular corridor, frail and bent. Then she gave an ooh of surprise and pointed past him. What's Ron doing here? He had noticed them too, as strode past groups of wizards who were huddled towards one another, discussing proceedings indistinctly. While they could not hear them, odd words spat out of the groups: illnesses, Widukind, and the Emperor Charlemagne. It was clear that it was the hearing they were discussing. "Hi," said Ron, and explained in haste he was in charge of Fluke Connection. "Last minute, your Uncle Regulus could not attend himself. I was trying to get your attention at the start, but it began really quickly." "Yes," replied Harry. "Very quickly. Suspiciously so." Hermione shot him a look. "Suspiciously?" asked Ron. "Like it's been decided already." He broke off and looked at the green glow in the fireplace next to them. The one adjacent was also showing the same picture. "Of course!" exclaimed Hermione, dragging them over. The news. Indeed it was. A news report was being transmitted to the fireplaces within the Parliament building. Harry recognized them from Hermione's Strasbourg apartment. They came on automatically, but he had found a way of stopping them to the apartment's fireplace. They huddled closely together, listening for the familiar voice of Anelia Morisi, reporting live from outside the European Council building, here in Strasbourg. "And, now it is midday, we have breaking news for you. Dozens of demonstrators have been arrested across Europe as protests against the hearing of the Declaration of Wizards turned violent. Lines of Aurors and non-wizard police and helmets blocked the streets of Strasbourg centered around the Wizarding Parliament building, arresting more than 2,000 demonstrators, chasing some of them down alleys to break up a protest of the fairness from today's hearing. We love the European Wizarding Union. They love our money and hate democracy," protesters chanted, a reference to widespread anger over potential government moves today following the strong position of the group calling themselves the Wizards of Old Magic. Others sat in the streets, awaiting arrest and reading copies of the European Magical Constitution. Amongst them, non-wizards, peaceful, refusing to give in to the waves of violence, waved banners which called for security, peace and equality. Some clashes have been reported and several dozen arrests have been made. The spark for today's protest, which erupted from the law-abiding occupation of Parliament Square from the very early hours of this morning, is the decision by the European Wizarding Council to block several opposition candidates from running for members of the Wizarding Parliament, asserting that they had not fulfilled the necessary criteria for election, a charge the candidates denied, throwing back the allegation to the Wizarding Parliament that they are being denied through lack of magical heritage. All of the candidates who have been barred come from non-magical families. European capitals from Paris to Moscow, Copenhagen to Athens saw flash rallies, strikes and violence on the streets. French jurors clashed with curse-throwing protesters who cast fires and smashed up rooms as thousands of people gathered for protests in Paris. Meanwhile, in Greece, a mass walkout of staff with non-wizard heritage, joined by wizards of all heritages and solidarity, crippled the flu, portable pensieve and broom traffic control. More than 2,000 people were arrested near the Wizarding Parliament building, the intended site of the election rally, which quickly became focused on the proceedings within the Wizarding Parliament chamber, the Witton, although many never made it there. The action in Europe saw wizards and non-wizards the world over take to the streets in dozens of Asian and African capitals, with cities in North and South America also braced for disruption later on Tuesday. A non-wizard reciprocator rally in London was carried off peacefully, and they said they were not expecting significant demonstrations or violence. The protest, which not authorized by the Ministry of Magic, was the latest in a series of street demonstrations staged as President Malfoy Jr. approval ratings have dipped amid economic hardship and social unrest. The authorities were prepared to suppress today's rally, and its leader, Alexander Nedasarks, opposition leader of the UU who had called the demonstration, was arrested on yesterday morning and sentenced to 30 days in jail for inciting wizarding violence. Other prominent opposition politicians including Jim Johnson, Peter Goodcave and Jean-Paul Laurent were also rounded up before the event. A post on the portable pensieve page of Mr. Yates, a street activist and one of the politicians who was barred from running, said 10 cloakterers had removed him from his house in Paris overnight before today's demonstration. It is horrible. My feeling is that we live under an occupation, said Natalia Slanik, 45, referring to the heavier presence in the city center. They fear that the end is coming, the end of this corrupt operation. Miss Slanik, a retired healer, added. We will have nobody to choose from on election day. At stake in the 30th June election are the 45 seats on the Strasbourg Witten, which is responsible for a Europe-wide wizarding budget and is controlled by the Liberal Party, all of whom are present today to decide the outcome of the Declaration of Wizards. Election officials have so far registered nearly 200 candidates, most of whom are largely supportive of Mr. Malfoy Jr. European protesters by the statue of the Navarre King, Henri IV, France, Paris confronted rioters during an unauthorized demonstration this morning, demanding that non-wizards be allowed to run for office in the local elections, despite pointing out that non-wizards were not the same as wizards with non-wizard parents. Protesters say that without diverse candidates, the coming parliament election is rigged. One woman, Anna Pay, bled from a blow to the head with a disarming spell aimed at her head. None of us was breaking the law. This situation was provoked by the police, said Miss Pay, her head wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. I even lost consciousness for a minute, she said while awaiting medical assistance. Even before the election dispute, protests had broken out in provincial cities. While today's flash demonstrations in the capital and other cities have pierced the image of unified support for Mr. Malfoy, the scale of support for such rallies is unclear. Strasbourgers said that 3,500 people came out for today's rally, including about 700 journalists and pensive bloggers, who had notified them that they would be attending. Nowhere, however, in this debate, have the names of the two wizards usually cited for inciting violence, Dumbledore and Grindelwald, been mentioned. It can only be hoped that this politically motivated, Europe-wide demonstration will be resolved very quickly. This is Anelia Morrissey reporting to you live, outside the European Wizarding Parliament. 88,888,888. An hour later and a call was broadcast throughout the outer corridor that they were to be reseated as the MUPs, and the Minister of the European Parliament were reassembling. Sitting next to one another now, with Ron with them, they waited for all of the 45 members to be seated, Harry's mind on the news report. If it was indeed true that there was an attempt to bar wizards with two non-magical parents, then that was an even greater act of discrimination than anything that had been heard there that morning. Hermione's job may be threatened. He was about to say something when Draco took his seat, waited until the 45 MUPs were ready, and then stood, to address them all. I will get straight to the point, Draco began. We have come to a unanimous verdict. We are all here today to investigate the claim, brought by the wizards of the old magic, that the right to live and be a wizard should be declared in European law. Myself, and my esteemed colleagues, Draco nodded to the MUPs, have discussed this matter in detail. And we'll still be out of here, with all of this taking half a day, declared Hermione, angrily under her breath. The charge of wizard life being eroded is upheld. Any attempt to impinge on wizarding life is henceforth illegal. Cheers and whoops came from the Wizards of Old Magic group, and Anders Hennig, who was at the center of the group. Draco looked at them, and waited until the audience was quiet again. That being so, any attempt to impinge on non-wizard life also illegal. Whispers and shouts went up, while Draco waited patiently. We, as the representatives of our nations, are unanimous in our feelings that wizards need to feel their way of life is not being eroded. Non-wizards have the right to equivalent freedoms, and as such there is an imbalance in persecution towards non-wizards. So, we have rejected the petition to enshrine in law the Declaration of Wizards, but may do so, in the future, should a similar petition be brought by non-wizards. He did it, declared Harry, to Ron and Hermione. Callias did it. They cannot use the law to justify conjurism, or the reformation of Dumbledore's army. He stole a glance past the faces of some of the wizards who brought the case, whose expressions ranged from disappointment, to indignation, to anger. Others, too, were locked in frantic discussions, some silent, but smiling, to that of Callias. He seemed to be immobile, and was looking at the floor. Had he heard? Harry wanted to go over to talk to him. But Draco was holding his wand, ready for another announcement. We have heard in detail the dangers that we, as wizards, are posing to the non-wizard population. Life has moved on since Clovis and Charlemagne. Draco looked for a moment at Harry. We are aware of the detriment to non-wizards' lives. After lengthy deliberation, I have no hesitation in declaring that the safety and security of all our citizens is of paramount importance. In order to de-escalate the situation, I have decided that wizards should hereby live concealed from non-wizards, that memory augmentation will be carried out by the end of next month, so that non-wizards should forget about wizards and wizards will continue to live in their communities unencumbered by non-wizards. No wizard should therefore feel their way of life under threat and in danger. Continue as we are and we may find ourselves in a state of civil war. We are to divide our world from that of non-wizards, live lives adjacent one another. Combined governments of wizard and non-wizard politicians will be disbanded. To do this we will need isolate ourselves, our presence and our way of life away from them, for their safety, and for ours. This decree has been passed in Europe and I will be taking this recommendation to the International Federation of Wizards next week. An atom dropped to the floor before Draco, and Harry was sure he had heard it. And then, its fission, exploding out of the silence like a bomb. No. Outrageous. Cries and shouts were being heard all over the chamber. Harry looked at Hermione, and then at Ron. Shut ourselves away from non-wizards? How would that even be possible? Where would anyone begin with such a task ahead of them? To his left, Harry saw that they had been joined by Cleus Lupin. It's the young Dumbledores all over again, said the British Minister for Magic. They've won. They haven't won, sir, said Hermione. The declaration was not passed. It amounts to the same thing. By dividing us from non-wizards, all those hatreds, all of those prejudices, will only get worse. And violence towards non-wizards will increase. I am sorry, sir, said Harry. The shame that he had not been able to communicate the historical record coming forth into his mind again. You did what I needed, Harry, said Cleus, cynicism etched like eroded rock in his pale face. I would guess that the verdict had already been decided. Harry followed Cleus's gaze to where the members of the Wizards of Old Magic were seated. They did indeed look satisfied. What do we do now? Do? Asked Cleus. We wait until the British Ministry receives instructions to do what Lucius's son has declared, mass befuddlement of the non-wizard population. Today is a textbook example of how propaganda begins. But we won't go down without a fight. And it will only serve to inflame the protests of today. Cleus smiled strangely at Harry, and glanced at Hermione. Suppressing non-wizard borns, Hermione said, angrily. Ron put his hand on her arm. Harry was about to ask Cleus what he meant by not going down without a fight, but a steward from the Vitandores had hurried over to them, and was inspecting Harry's name badge. Harry Potter, he wheezed, looking desperately at him. Good. I've found you, at last. An encrypted clue from your father. From my father? Harry echoed, looking between Ron and Hermione, and then at Cleus. He knew I was here, working today. The skinny, dark-haired steward shrugged. As it's encrypted, you may take it in one of the meeting rooms. In a small room, just off the circular outer corridor, Harry was shown a fireplace which, within, was a green glow. Here you are, sir, said the steward. Harry stepped in, quickly followed by Hermione and Ron. The door swung closed, and Harry approached the fire. But it was not his dad's face in the flames, but Sirius's. I had to tell them I was James. This is a security nightmare, Sirius began, his face flickering wildly. Ron took out his wand and held it near the grate, and the image stabilized. Thanks, said Harry, and looked back to Sirius. His face had an agonized expression on it, as if he was trying to think of the right words. I'll just say it, Harry. Your dad has been called to the ministry. He left school last night, and collected a marriage license that he had arranged from Hedger Mead. He was not alone. Crystal Leobrandt also left school. They were married last night. But, Sirius shouted, as if to prevent Harry from interrupting. Sam he had a confrontation with another boy from school, leaving him with horrific curse injuries. Fraser Blewett. The Avada Kedavra curse. There is a warrant out for Sam's arrest. 88,888,888. At about the same time as the hearing finished, not 500 yards from the perimeter of the Parliament building, beyond even the most ardent of protesters, a temporarily absent head teacher and a determined student left another deserted farmhouse. The boy, closing the book he promised to read, noting the promise of his glowing friend Finder, and began their traverse towards the German border.